This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I am here today joined by Mr. John Schwartz, a gentleman who is a major stakeholder in the ultra premium wine business in California. How are you today, sir?
Doing pretty good. It's been an interesting year, but we're hanging in there and still making and drinking good wine.
Right. Well, we have been speaking with winemakers all over the globe about how they've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. But when I spoke to you last week, you were telling me that you had virtually forgotten about that because you've had many other things on your plate. Would you mind explaining to our viewers where you are at right now in the Californian wine industry with the ongoing fire issues?
Yeah, it's been a year, Jamie, of sort of a double whammy. 6 months ago, when COVID started, everyone had to pivot their wine business to try to make the most of it and keep the revenue lines going. And on August 18th, last month, fires broke out in Napa Valley yet again and made us sort of forget about COVID and
Yes.
dealt with bigger issues, which is protecting our properties and our vineyards from the fires. And then secondly, the resulting smoke damage and smoke taint that's occurred not only in Napa Valley, but throughout California and actually the northwest up in Oregon and Washington as well. So we're dealing with quite a lot of things here, and a lot of insurance companies.
I can imagine. I can imagine. And where are the fires at today? They're still raging, I believe.
So they're not raging in Napa Valley
Right.
anymore. They got them contained about 2 weeks ago. Southern California, there's fires that are only 15% contained.
Wow.
And I know that in Oregon, a lot of wineries are currently evacuating, similar to what we did 3-4 weeks ago. And Washington, same situation.
When we spoke last week, you very much you came over as being very much a straight shooter, and you were speaking about what you think is going to happen with the Napa Vintage 2020. Would you mind sharing that with our viewership?
Sure. I think, for the most part, no one wants bad press.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's a bad vintage, in France, in Napa Valley, everybody holds their chin up and says, it's a good year. And I think that in Napa Valley this year is going to be extremely challenging for a lot of winemakers. I used to say that in some years where the weather conditions weren't ideal, the difference between a good winemaker and a great winemaker is a great winemaker can make good wine in a crummy year, whereas a good winemaker can probably make a very average or below average year in a crummy year. This year is different because the smoke lingered in the valley for weeks, and it smelled like a campfire. And I think that a lot of wineries won't be picking. Some will. Some will hope that they can make good wine or plausible wine. Making excellent wine out of this vintage is, in my opinion, almost going to be impossible.
Right.
A lot of the top winemakers are picking. What happens, Jamie, is once the smoke molecules bind themselves to the skins, it's not the berry testing that really matters. When people send in the berries to these labs to get testing, it's when you start fermentation, and that's when it really starts to manifest itself. And you might see it during fermentation, you might see it during the vinification process, during the barrel process, or maybe 10 years down the road when it's in the bottle, but it's there.
But it was making me think, I mean, I've tasted wines with smoke taint before, and they really are quite something. If you don't get it on the nose, you definitely get it on the palate. And as you were saying, campfire is one of those aromatics, flavors that come through. You would think that, of all the places in the world to get smoke taint, the Napa Valley would be one of the better, because you're talking about Cabernet for the most part here. You make higher alcohol wines with very, very low pH. And of course, Cabernet is thicker skinned than those poor Oregonians with their Pinot Noir up there. I mean, I think their vintage is going to be a complete wipeout. But you're thinking right now from your growers, how are things looking?
So we do grow more than Cabernet in
Yeah.
Napa
Yeah.
Valley.
Yes. Yeah.
Cabernet is king here. And you're correct, Jamie, that it's got one of the more resilient skins, the thicker skin than, let's say, Petit Verdot or Merlot or Cab Franc. So I think that, the hope is that some of the Cabernet and some of the pockets in Napa Valley will be okay. It's too early to tell. I don't think we're going to have answers until we start doing more. Everyone's been doing micro fermentations and bucket fermentations,
Mm-hmm.
and if you pick the grapes, you're really not going to know until the juice is dry before you have some type of indication whether or not there's smoke damage. But to your point about how people detect it, we talked about this last week. The cork taint is something that most of the population doesn't really know what it smells like.
Right.
But once you do know what it smells like, it's one of the biggest deterrents to wine in the world. I can't stand the smell. I can smell it from a mile away. But it took years for consumers and winemakers and experts like yourself to have the experience of smelling that. Wildfires are relatively new here. We've only had them, if you think about it, for the last 4 years. Australia is much more well-versed in dealing with smoke damage than we are. But in terms of the aromatics, you might not smell it in the grapes, but in the taste, it's the back palate where you get it. And in the back palate, you get this sensation like you're licking an ashtray. And that's what smoke damage really is. And I've tasted wines from 17 when we had the big fires that broke out actually during harvest, which is a little different than the fires we had last month that broke out just after veraison. And then in 18, there's a lot of smoke damage as well from the fires up north, which were called the Paradise or campfires that drop smoke onto the valley, just primarily in the higher elevations. So those areas were more affected than the valley floor. But this particular fire was everywhere, and the smoke was everywhere in Napa Valley, and east of Napa Valley, west of Napa Valley, south and north. I mean, it was, it blanketed the whole area.
Did you get any ash on your fruit at all?
So we did get ash, and the indication of ash is if your car, if you had a black car, you would see every day white ash on your car, or on your porch. So it was circulating, and there was ash everywhere. There was a couple days when the sun, you couldn't even see the sun here. You felt like you were in the northern exposure or something, where it was just dark all day long. And it was because the clouds were so thick with smoke that the sun had no chance of even showing itself.
Now, I know this has been a point of contention for many people. What do you put these fires down to?
Well, this time it was lightning. Well, if you don't believe in climate change, you're not living on this planet. This was lightning striking. It was weird weather conditions striking when it was really dry. There was very low humidity, which is very conducive to wildfires spreading. And it had nothing to do with PG&E, which was our electric provider. That was in 17 when the winds were so strong and it knocked power lines down that started the fires. This was started by lightning. We had hundreds and thousands of lightning strikes in the middle of August. And typically we say the fire season starts in September in California, and it caught us off guard. It started in mid-August, and that's not to say that it's not going to start even earlier in ensuing years.
Now, excuse my ignorance here, how does crop insurance usually work, and how is it working throughout these fires?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So some wineries have crop insurance, some don't. As a grape grower, I know a number of growers have called me saying, hey, John, I don't have crop insurance. Would you pick our fruit for free just in case it's good? And maybe we could bulk it out. Wineries that do have crop insurance, there's two schools of thought. One is it's better than nothing, and maybe it covers your farming costs. The other school of thought is it still doesn't cover for business income loss, which is the value you get from producing wine and bottling it and selling it at wholesale price or retail price. So crop insurance is based on a price, average price per ton in Napa Valley. So let's say you have 10 acres, and let's say you do 3 tons per acre. That's 30 tons of fruit. And let's say the Napa Valley average is $8,000, you get $240,000. That's probably equivalent to what your farming costs are on those 10 acres. But for the most part, it's a lost vintage.
So if you were making an insurance claim, those micro fermentations you were talking about, you would be using those for the insurance claim, right?
You have to.
Right.
The insurance companies want to know that the wine is damaged. They already know this year that the damage happened while it was a crop, meaning it was a grape on the vine. In 17, it was a very gray area because, it happened during harvest, and no one, it could have happened when the smoke entered the winery. It could have happened when, during fermentation or during the winemaking process. And that's when you can have a good argument with an insurance company that, it was a wine, it wasn't a grape, which is a big delta in terms of insurance coverage.
Of course, of course. And how satisfied have you been with the support you have received or haven't received from the regional level of government, your state level of government, and the federal government?
Well, I think that every wine growing region in the world has different types of subsidies. There's some countries that have far greater subsidies than we have here in California. The USDA, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has just come out with a program to further supplement crop insurance, COVID-related stuff, and business interruption benefits, which I think a lot of wineries will try to take advantage of. But for the most part, dealing with insurance companies, whether or not you're anywhere in the world and you have floods or whatever, it's a long process and a lot of paperwork. And sometimes you don't get the answer you want, which means you have to engage your counsel to help you.
Yes.
Right now, we're just trying to make sure, between COVID and the fires, you're trying to keep your employees, you're trying to keep enough cash flow going. This has really been the most challenging harvest in the world, 2020. It's not just us, it's a lot of places in the world. It's unreal.
Do you feel that the double whammy of COVID and these fires will basically lead to many of the smaller operations, winery operations in California, giving up?
I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are tired. When you deal with fires, you don't just deal with smoke damage, you're dealing with replacing your irrigation, replacing your fences, dealing with hundreds of fallen trees, and it's an exhausting process. And I think a lot of smaller wineries that live check by check, or trying to keep their staff employed and not furloughed, and trying to keep a market going when COVID is still very prevalent, is a very challenging endeavor for anybody. And we are trying, we're not small, we're medium, but I still consider ourselves pretty small. And what you do is if you don't have a 2020 harvest, you start figuring out, okay, well, we probably won't see that hit for 2 or 3 years when you don't have wine. So how do you deal with the most important things right now, which are COVID-related marketing and business exercises?
And speaking of COVID, how has that impacted things in your neighborhood, in your area, in your region?
Yeah, so it's had a big impact because people aren't traveling as much, and Napa Valley thrives off tourism. We get millions of tourists a year. I mean, we're right behind Disneyland and Yosemite in terms of tourists. And so when tourists aren't coming and aren't spending, and the private jet people aren't coming, and the hotels aren't full, and the restaurants aren't full, it's a big problem. So the on-trade in Napa Valley is struggling because you can only, right now, the regulations with COVID are 25% in dining, So most restaurants only have 6 or 8 tables, and they're
Yes.
relying on outside dining right now, which is great until the rain comes, if it comes this fall. And I think we're all trying to figure out, where to sell wine. And uh, there was a great push in March and April and May when people were staying at home, buying wine, people enjoying virtual tastings. That stuff has kind of died off because there's a fatigue factor.
Yeah.
And then the export markets are dry because they have the same COVID issues that we have. Malaysia, for example, doesn't let any tourists in until January. Most countries still have 14-day quarantine periods.
Yes.
Travel retail market is dead, meaning cruise lines, airlines, duty-free shops. So then you look at, what are the thriving markets in the United States right now, and it is off trade. Some of the big box places that do high-end wines are doing well. On the e-commerce platform, we've done a lot of creative initiatives to try to get people to buy wine, whether or not it's co-branding with meat companies or fish companies or caviar companies.
Yes, yeah.
And so we've, every few weeks we do these creative initiatives that our customers seem to enjoy, and they want to support us. And the outpouring of support, not only because of COVID, but because of the fires, has been phenomenal. And my question is, what else is going to come in the next 3 months before this year is up? Remember, we live on a fault here too. So, I'm not ruling out earthquakes or other calamities.
Please don't say that. You have the election coming up as well, so that could be a crunch point. Well, thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution today. Really appreciate your time, and I'm glad that we finally managed to get our meeting organized. I'm out as you can see, I'm out in the countryside, and internet is not always that reliable. But John, thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution today. Really enjoyed your company. Bye for now.
Jamie, thanks for having me, and keep up the great work.
Thank you.